All right. Good morning, agents. This is Kevin Lauren. I'm the Director of Training and Marketing here at Alta Realty Group. And today we're going to be joined by Lauren Noack and Bill Seitz. We're going to go through some really good stuff. Before we get into today's presentation, we're also going to have Debbie Ciccone come on the line. But let me bring Bill Seitz, our corporate broker, on the line first. Good morning, Bill. How are you today?
Good morning, Kevin. Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year to you.
Yeah, unfortunately was unable to make last Wednesday's meeting, so this is my first webinar of the new year. So really happy to get these things back on track every Wednesday and bring some good content to y'all.
Heck yeah, always a pleasure to join all of you fine people on a Wednesday. And yeah, so today should be great. We're gonna have Lauren join us. Lauren is our expert on all things contracts and so forth. So that'll be awesome to have her join us as usual. But any other updates, Bill, before we bring on Debbie Ciccone from Clearview Mortgage?
Next week, we're going to have DJ Bibb with Fidelity National Title. He's going to do his marketing title kind of combo kickoff. And so we're going to hear from him about what the top agents are using title for, not just in their preliminary title reports and their information searches, but also how they're using title in growing their business. So looking forward to that next Wednesday with DJ Bibb.
Yeah, that's awesome. DJ is a consummate professional. Really lucky to have him. I know a lot of you guys have been working with him, so that's been great. So awesome. Well, before we bring Lauren on the line, let's have Debbie from Clearview Mortgage join us. Debbie, good morning. How are you today?
Oh, I am fantastic as usual. I hope everybody's doing great. I don't know about you, but I started ramping up, getting really busy. So it is pretty active out there. What I wanted to share with you today, couple things. One, what are the rates these days? Everybody's probably thinking that. As of this moment, okay, because the rates have been hovering now in the fives. So FHA and VA rates are hovering around 5.9. So it could be 5.875 1 minute or earlier in the day, 5.9. Let's see, today is Wednesday. So by Fridays, rates usually go down. Fridays are usually the best day, not guaranteed all the time, but typically Fridays are the best day. With regular conventional, so FHA and VA are hovering around 5.9, 5.875%. 30-year fixed conventional interest rates are around 6.5%. And this is with no origination points. So anybody could buy the rate down. If you want a 5.75% 30-year fixed interest rate, then just for an example, 5.75%. I don't know if you want to hear this. It's $23,000. But you could get the 30-year fixed below 6% by a couple ways, doing the 2-1 buy down, the 3-2-1 buy down, or just buying it down. And then the other thing that I wanted to share with you guys today, because this is becoming kind of a popular program, and I always started out, what if you were able to get a buyer in that had self-employed, maybe tax returns show low net income, but they have some money, 20-30% to put down on a home. They just don't qualify by themselves. You can actually we can actually get a buyer in a home and actually as an investment purchase with 20-30% down or more, with no qualifying on the buyer's end. It's called DSCR, debt service coverage ratio. And so debt coverage is kind of a key word. Basically, if the estimated rental income, short-term or long-term, rental estimate that shows on the appraisal. When the appraiser goes out, we request this information. So he's going to give us either the short-term or the long-term rental estimate. If that estimated rent, even though the place isn't rented currently, that estimated rent, as long as it covers the total principal, interest, taxes, and insurance on that property, then the buyer doesn't qualify. No tax returns are involved, no pay stubs, no nothing. So you can get a buyer to be able to purchase a home without qualifying. There's some catchy things to this. The interest rates are in the 7s. I don't think it's gone into the low 6s yet, but I'll tell you what, it's pretty close. But they have to own another property. Unless they're like in New York and they want to buy a property in, by the beach, or in California as an investment property, but they can't buy a property, fairly close to where they live, if they don't currently own a property. So that could be an issue. They have to at least own a property, and it has to make sense that they are going to purchase it as an investment property. So keep that in mind when, if you get a buyer that says, I don't think my taxes are going to qualify. Ask a few more questions, see how much they're putting down, and see if we can help them. And call me always if you have any questions. I hope you have a great week.
Thank you, Debbie. Appreciate that. Debbie's always got a good solution for your buyers. So definitely check her out.
Yeah,
Bill,
so that's a cool program because the property is qualifying, not the person. So if that makes sense, the property on its own merit and its own income and revenue that it's able to produce is what's qualifying the property, not the person. So that's another creative type of financing that we can do.
super cool, Bill.
Yeah, so you know what? It's having all these little tools in the tool belt to get things done, and that's what we're all about, making sure we can get things done and helping our clients.
That's for sure. All right, great. Well, I appreciate that, Debbie, as usual. Let's bring Lauren on the line with us. Lauren, good morning.
Hello, good morning.
It's great to have you as usual. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well.
All right, so we're going to talk about the buyer broker agreement. So this is super, super cool. It's very important. It impacts every deal. So take it away, Lauren.
Awesome, thank you so much. Let me share my screen here.
And as Lauren's pulling that her screen share up, we've all heard about what's happened in these big lawsuits and big industry decisions. This buyer broker agreement is going to become more, more of a relevant document, especially how we move through and how these, this perceived decision rolls out and probably goes into other areas of the country. For the moment, it was just in, I believe, what was it, Missouri, maybe Illinois, and one of the other, maybe Tennessee, I'm not sure, but it was basically affecting 3 states and all the big players out there, Remax, I believe Compass, and what's the other big one? Keller Williams and a couple other ones. So, we just thought it would be a good idea, as Lauren is a CAR certified forms advisor. She's also licensed, DRE license, and also runs a transaction coordinating company, is very well qualified to give us some tips and pointers about this document and how it can be utilized and how you can protect yourself moving forward in representing buyers.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the intro. I think I'm set up now. Does everybody see the right? here.
Lauren, it looked like it was about to load up and then it didn't. So you may want to try it one more time.
Gotcha. Okay, let's see what I can do here. One day I'll get this going correctly.
Oh, you and me both.
Okay,
More like a
so
lifelong goal or
right.
mastering live webinars. There you go.
Enter full screen mode.
Sometimes you just have to hit that. I think there's one more button that actually says share.
How
That's
about that?
that'll do.
Excellent. Okay. So, let's see, let's get started here. Hello, everybody. Bill did a wonderful intro, so I can skip over most of this. Again, my name is Lauren Noack. I am with the TC Advantage. I am CAR certified as a transaction coordinator and also as a forms trainer. So anytime there is a new form update or a revision, we get specialized training in how to explain it and teach it to the masses. And same goes for delving into the purchase agreement as well. So today is specifically, it's a presentation. It's a little bit different than the ones I typically do here. This one is centered around, obviously, the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. This used to be, this form came out and replaced 3 other buyer broker agreements. And so there's going to be a little bit of change in the language as far as how it's referenced, but the technical term for it is the buyer representation agreement, but we refer to it often as the buyer broker agreement. So we're going to talk today a little bit about why we need to be using this, and what purpose it can serve. Trying to get a little bit better understanding on the breakdown of it, and what that workflow looks like. And I'm going to attempt to kind of educate you on their function, and then really try and empower you to use them on a more regular basis. So here's a little overview of the key points we're going to hit on in no particular order. So the buyer broker agreements are not new. And why are we talking about them now? Like Bill mentioned, the main reason why these have come to the foreground again is the verdict out of Kansas City, Missouri last year on Halloween. And this was in regards to the lawsuit against NAR, the National Association of Realtors, and 2 other of the big box brokerages. And the claim was that there was a conspiracy to inflate the commissions by enforcing a cooperative compensation rule. So basically requiring the listing brokers to offer compensation to the buyer brokers, effectively setting like a price floor for commissions and thus inflating seller costs. So it wasn't necessarily on the grounds of why does the seller have to pay commission to the buyer's agent? I know that's been kind of reduced down to that breakdown, but it's actually more the lawsuit was on the grounds of you're being deceptive and trying to get me to pay more than I should, not necessarily about who it's going to, if that makes sense. The other thing to note is that this lawsuit and the verdict are state specific. It's not national, or it's not in a federal court. So if it was in federal court, it would have nationwide implications. And the Department of Justice has been keeping a close eye on this case and others like it, which has a lot of people on edge. But for now, this ruling is limited to Missouri, or this verdict is limited to Missouri. It's also not final. So yes, the jury returned a verdict and a number for damages, but there's still appeals to be made and a final distribution of damages awarded. So the true fallout is still a little ways away, and it's kind of next to impossible to determine. Okay, great. So what does all that matter? Well, because some of you may also remember that literally minutes after this verdict was announced, the attorney for the plaintiffs filed another lawsuit against other real estate companies, and it's a much bigger lawsuit. And more of these so-called kind of copycat lawsuits are popping up all over the country. So nobody wants to be the next brokerage or, God forbid, agent named in any of these lawsuits. Luckily for us, California and CAR specifically has always been kind of ahead of the curve in our contract requirements when it comes to commissions and just documentation in general. Just in my network of transaction coordinators, I see a lot of contracts from other states, and California is by far the heaviest, thickest, most intense set of paperwork. So that really works in our favor. And a lot of these things that other states are freaking out about, we've already had implemented, and it's just a matter of utilizing them. So that's why there's kind of a little bit more of an urgency now to make this a regular part of the home buying process. And remember that this lawsuit really was kind of about transparency. So there's a big stigma around buyer representation agreements. One of the biggest pitches for the longest time to get buyers to use an agent is, my services are free. The seller pays for my services. And so the biggest struggle in utilizing these forms and this practice is going to be around reframing the conversation and showing your value as a buyer's agent. The concept of a buyer's agent hasn't always been the norm. It wasn't until 1988 that California legislature implemented agency disclosure requirements. 1988. So up until then, the seller and their interests were represented, and the buyers were always just considered customers. And it took a lot of work and, kind of focus to get buyers their own representation in these transactions. Currently, these buyer representation forms aren't mandatory. So as a buyer's agent, right, why use something if you don't have to? Why would you want to use this buyer broker agreement? Maybe you have been or want to avoid being taken advantage of by a buyer that has you show them a bunch of homes and then just writes an offer through another agent. Maybe there's a disagreement between you and another agent on who actually showed the buyers the home and who's entitled to the commission. Maybe you want buyers to feel you're committed to them, or you want them to show that they're committed to you. Maybe you're tired of low commission splits offered by listing agents that think you just open doors. Maybe you see how almost all other professional relationships begin with and utilize a documented agreement. Maybe you want to avoid being named in a claim regarding non-disclosure of compensation. Maybe you want to be prepared in the event there's a legal change regarding the MLS mandatory offer compensation. Maybe you believe buyers should be aware of everything you do for them and see this as a demonstration of that. Okay, so now we know if buyers were required to pay a commission to their agent on top of the other costs associated with home buying, it would spell disaster. And the current system of sellers paying agents to bring them a qualified buyer probably isn't going to change drastically anytime soon. The key here is just to be more transparent about the process and really to know your options. So here's the best way to wrap your head around it. The buyer signs the BRBC, right? The buyer representation and broker compensation agreement with the buyer's agent. Let's say in this agreement, they agree to pay their agent 3% for their services. Now, separately, you have a seller that signs the RLA, the residential listing agreement, with the seller's agent. And let's say that listing agreement is for a total of 5% commission. So you have these two separate agreements at two separate times with these two separate parties. So from that 5% total, the seller's agent will designate an amount to offer to the cooperating agent and display that on the MLS, or if it's an off market, you'll use that CBC, cooperating broker compensation form. Now that 2.5% goes towards the 3% cost of the buyer's agent's services. And this leaves the buyer with another 0.5% that they would be responsible for paying to the buyer's agent. At this point, perfectly acceptable for escrow and the lender to be notified of this additional buyer cost and proceed as usual. Or the buyer can ask the seller to pay that extra 0.5% by requesting it on the purchase agreement and using the additional SPBB form. Now remember, each of these points of signing is an option for negotiation. There are pros and cons to each scenario, but this is an option. And it's one of those things where it has to happen in this specific order, and this has to be taken care of in as much advance as possible. And we'll go over those details here in a second. The other thing to note is that when you're a listing agent receiving an offer from a buyer, don't skip over this section in the contract. This is one of those times where a single checkbox can make or break a transaction. It's literally a matter of one tiny checkbox in the purchase agreement. Okay, so if the seller agrees to cover the buyer's 0.5%, then that's in addition to the 5% they're already agreeing to pay the listing broker, and it gets paid directly to the buyer's broker. So you wouldn't modify your listing agreement to show a total of 5.5% commission, because only 5 of that is going to the seller's broker. The other 0.5% is going to the buyer's broker. Is this making sense so far? So the seller would be paying more. It wouldn't recalculate the splits already going to the listing side. This is all in addition to.
Well, yeah, and Lauren, that extra 0.5% is a negotiated point in the contract, not in the listing agreement.
Exactly. So now let's get into these forms and kind of how to fill them out. The first one that we're going to discuss, obviously, is the BRBC, or the Buyer Representation and Broker Commission Agreement. This is the one that we're going to be in. This has the bulk of the information, and I'm just going to kind of jump out to some of the other forms referenced in it as we go along. The first thing to note on this form is the representation period is calculated in days. There's not a start date and an end date. It's just X amount of days after your start date. This is also a non-exclusive agreement by default. You can make it exclusive in the next section, but this is non-exclusive by default to make it a bit more disarming to most people. So when the CAR Forms Committee got together and kind of recalibrated and merged those 3 forms into this form, they're really trying to, again, destigmatize the concept, make it really straightforward and as non-scary as possible. The next item asks about any pre-existing relationships. So it's okay if they exist, they just have to be identified or disclosed. Same thing on the listing agreement, right? This is in accordance with NAR's Code of Ethics. So just let us know what the current situation is. Again, transparency. And Section 3 requires a sort of definition of the property to be acquired. And too narrow of a description in this section, and it might not be protective enough, in the sense that if you write down a specific address and then they end up, asking you to show something different, or they end up, finding something online and then they end up purchasing that, you don't want to make it too specific so that it doesn't encapsulate the work that you're going to be doing with your buyers. But if you make it too broad, then that could be too problematic and really difficult to enforce. The one important element in this section is that if you leave this blank, it could be unenforceable entirely. This is one of the main terms in this agreement, is the type of property that you're going to be helping the buyers to locate and acquire. Remember, this is an opportunity to have a conversation with your client about what exactly they're looking for. Nobody wants their time wasted, so take this section seriously. Moving on to Section 4, you can see the very first sentence, again, is a reminder about compensation being negotiable. One of the issues in the Missouri case is that their contracts don't have this terminology as often and as blatant as it is. You can find this disclaimer on almost all agreements involving any kind of commission. It's just a reminder of like, this is negotiable, and we put it everywhere in the California forms. So this is where you're going to identify payment or compensation. The default is a percentage. That's probably going to be the most common. Or you can check the second box if it's a flat fee, or you can check the third box for like an attached compensation schedule. Some agents will do, you know, if your price point is, you know, between this amount, this is what it will be. If it's between this amount, or if it's in this location, it'll be whatever. You can have a specific schedule. And you would check box 3. This is an either or scenario. Do not check multiple boxes, only one. California law also requires this notice about exclusive relationships, and you can check box 2. This is where you would change this from the default of a non-exclusive agreement to an exclusive one. It also defines the expectations for involvement. The broker is only entitled to compensation if the buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker, or the broker showed the property to the buyer virtually, or the broker submitted to the seller a signed written offer, or the property was introduced to the buyer by the broker. It calls out agents specifically saying just sending the buyer a list of properties doesn't count as broker involvement. Sorry, Charlie. Gonna have to do a little bit more work than that. We're gonna skip item C and come back to it. This section 4D talks about what happens to this agreement if this agreement of the buyer paying a certain amount, if the agent ends up getting paid another way. So if the listing side, that cooperating commission that is offered, right, that 2.5% in that previous slide. So if anyone other than the buyer compensates the broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited toward the buyer's obligation to pay compensation. So again, if you remember from the previous slides, that's how we landed on the buyer now only being responsible for 0.5% out of that original 3%. And in 4D3, you can see the default is for the buyer to give authorization to the broker to include a request in the buyer's offer. Remember, this is getting signed before any offers being written, and ideally before any properties are being shown. So this is something that, again, gets the conversation going and gets people thinking about these scenarios ahead of time. They can make a part of the offer asking the seller to pay this difference. If the buyer doesn't want that, you can check a box and remove the authorization. If they're like, I don't care, it's just 0.5%. It could be just 0.5%. It could be 1%. You never know. It's a good idea to leave this open, not check that box, because you never know, again, what sort of properties your client will want to make an offer on, kind of once you get going. And it's possible leaving this overage as a buyer obligation would cap them out when it comes to any lender credits. So it might be something that is good to kind of keep in your back pocket if things get really tight with your purchase price. Then it's something they can eventually request from the seller. It's the same sort of request for like a rate buy down or a credit towards closing costs, that sort of a thing. Okay, so let's hop out of this BRBC form real quick and see what that looks like, asking the seller to cover this amount. So here in the RPA, at the very top of page 2, this is section 3G3 in the grid, there's an option to check a box stating the seller agrees to pay the buyer's obligation of commission to the buyer's agent. That's it, just that one little box incorporates this other, excuse me, SPBB form. And if the seller signs this agreement, right, then this is the term already in there in the contract. The seller agrees to pay this obligation. So it also, again, incorporates this SPBB form into the contract, and that form does require signatures from both parties to be considered. So don't think that you can just check this box in the contract and slip it in and then do the SPBB later. That has to be signed at the same time. And then paragraph 18 that's referenced here in that second column, that also mentions that the seller is entitled to a copy of the written buyer representation agreement. Only the section that talks about compensation, so you can just send them that one page. But keep that in mind. Don't try and get sneaky. Don't try and, retroactively do all of this stuff. They need to see a copy of the agreement. The agreement needs to be completed prior to the offer being written. And so again, these timelines are really important to keep in mind. Okay, so this is the actual form. This is another one-page form, really straightforward. it outlines very clearly when this form should be used. Right at the top, do not use this form if you do not have a signed buyer representation agreement in place. Don't even use it. Do not use this form if the amount the listing broker is offering already covers the amount in the buyer representation agreement. If your buyer representation agreement is for, I need a minimum of 2%, right? If you're worried that with these lawsuits, agents are going to start offering 0% cooperating commission or, 1%, whatever, maybe 2%. Now, if you're getting offered 2.5% on the MLS, you don't need this form. It's already covered. You don't have to worry about it. So don't use it. Do not use this form if the buyer's broker is waiving the shortage of commission offered. So if you have this 3% agreement in place and the listing side is only offering 2.5%, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to waive that. I don't want you to incur more costs. I don't want you to possibly, be vulnerable in negotiations with this term. Don't worry about that 0.5%. We'll waive it. Don't use this form. You don't need it. And then further on down the form, right, this lets both parties know one more time that commissions are negotiable. You're going to see this everywhere. The next part can be easily messed up if you guys are going too fast and not paying attention, but it's really simple math. It's 1 minus 2 equals 3. So section 1 is letting the seller know what the buyer's obligation is, right? What they agreed to pay the agent in that BRBC. Section 2 is confirmation of what the seller's broker is offering the buyer's broker on the MLS or via CVC. And then section 3 is the difference between 1 and 2. And that's the amount that the buyer is asking the seller to cover. So first you tell the seller what your agreement with the agent is, what the agent's getting offered, and then what the seller is being asked to cover. Okay, moving back to that BRBC form again, we're in section 4E. This is sort of a safety clause for the broker. You have one of these in the listing agreement. There's that section that entitles the listing broker to the compensation even after the listing expires or cancels. This is in this agreement as well, the version of this. So again, in the same way that you sign your listing agreement with your sellers, this is the same sort of conversation and approach you should be taking with your buyers. And a lot of these terms are similar. It does have its own requirements, however, in order to be implemented. So first, the agent must provide the buyer a written notice of the properties where there was broker involvement prior to the expiration of the agreement. Or if you cancel the agreement, there's some time specified when you have to deliver this documentation. So it's the same way in the listing, right? If your listing expires, before your listing expires, you give your seller a list of buyers that you showed the property, or the list of names. And then after it expires, if the seller then sells to one of those buyers, you're entitled to that commission, right? If that section in the listing agreement is completed. Same concept here. So make sure you're tracking your properties, your showings, everything needs to be documented for your own protection. And again, transparency. CAR has a new form for that. It's called the NPIB, the Notice of Broker Involved Properties. We'll go over that in a second too. So if this agreement expires or the buyer cancels it and they purchase a property you're working with them on, and it falls within this kind of designated time frame, right, then you would be entitled to this 3% commission or whatever we have in the agreement. And so with that, let's jump back to section C in this form, and we're going to talk about the cancellation of this agreement. Because even if we're looking at like a non-exclusive agreement, people always like to have a clear way out, and we should, same way, that people try to encourage prenups or wills before you're dead, right? Let's get the bad stuff out of the way and talk about worst case scenario while everybody is all happy and alive. So first is that either party can cancel this agreement via written notice. And there's a CAR form, of course, for this cancellation, and that's called the COBR, cancellation of buyer representation. So we'll look at that a little bit later, but if this is a non-exclusive agreement, right, which is the default, then the cancellation is effective immediately once you provide this signed cancellation form. However, If you have the box checked and making this an exclusive agreement, then the cancellation of representation takes effect 30 days after receipt of the notice of cancellation. So if your buyer is the one that cancels, or if you're like, I need to get out of this and you want to cancel it, and or your buyer all of a sudden doesn't qualify, or there's some reason why this needs to get canceled, but it's an exclusive cancellation, you're now waiting 30 days. And if something goes into escrow during those 30 days, you're still bound by this representation agreement. So keep that in mind. Again, some of the pros and cons with these forms. Also, if the broker intends to activate that safety clause that we talked about, then they have to deliver that written list of properties within 5 calendar days after the effective date of the cancellation. So if it's non-exclusive and you cancel it today, you have 5 calendar days to deliver this list. If it's an exclusive agreement, you essentially have 35 days to cancel or to provide that written list, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's look at those two forms. Anybody have any questions so far? I'm kind of going through this quickly.
I will point out one thing that I just think is super important, is keeping accurate logs of the property shown, and probably keeping a MLS printout of, and maybe writing notes on it, like showed, you know, this property at 4:30 Monday evening on 1:15, and who was with your clients, you know, brother accompanied the showing. Have just some notes, just so everything is super, you know, logged.
Yep.
Because what you don't want to have happen is, you know, you show the property, and then they try to potentially, and you know, doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Then they end up going to the listing agent, maybe on the open house a subsequent weekend, and just decide to go write the offer because the listing agent doesn't think that you have this buyer broker agreement in place, and they think for some reason they're getting a better deal, or maybe the listing agent is being unethical and trying to convince them to write the offer with them so they can have a dual agency. So the more that you keep track of all of your showings and know who was there, what time you showed up, and keep a tangible, maybe a little folder or something with these properties, you'll be in a better spot if you have to defend yourself and try to go and get your commission.
Yep, 100%. So, and we'll look over next here the CAR form that helps you kind of track some of that stuff as well. But first, the actual cancellation of this representation agreement. So this isn't just a cancellation so that the buyer gets out of paying the agent and their broker. This is a termination of representation. And this just kind of reiterates all the terms from that previous paragraph in the BRBC. But it might be a good idea at this point to even include this form in your presentation to the buyer of like, hey, here's the cancellation. If you ever decide that you don't want to move forward with me representing you as a buyer, here you go. You can cancel this at any time. And just kind of give them that peace of mind, right? They already have the form. They can use it anytime. Again, we want to try and make this concept a little less scary and a little less about commissions and more about representation. So you have the section that states either party can cancel. They either one can cancel the agreement. It, of course, lays out the effective date of the cancellation based on it being either exclusive or non-exclusive. And then it points back to the BRBC in determining the terms for any compensation, right? So if you completed that safety clause, whatever the terms are that were filled out in that area, that's where it points you to reference for compensation. What this form adds to the equation is clarification that there's no continuing right to representation. So even if they open escrow on a property shown by the agent prior to the cancellation, the agent doesn't have to have anything to do with it. They'll collect the commission, but they're not going to negotiate or represent the buyer in any way. So this is all on page 1 of this cancellation form. At the bottom is a section for signatures if it's a unilateral cancellation or if it's a mutual cancellation, depending on what kind of cancellation this is. But then the second page has additional terms, right, that come into play. So if this, you'll see the little yellow dot down there at the bottom, right? If there's additional specifications for the type of compensation, this is if it's different from whatever the agreement is in the buyer representation agreement. So, and here you check the box that applies. Again, this is if the terms need to be different from what was in the BRBC. So you have option A to specify broker involvement, right? You can list out specifics right here. If you're like, you need to be the one canceling this, here's your list. Option B outlines if there's any expenses incurred. Option C is for the broker to receive a referral fee. If they're like, I'm going out of town or on vacation, and I'm just going to give this to another agent and I'm just going to collect a referral fee, right? And so you're canceling this representation agreement because they're going to another agent and they're getting a referral for it. Option D is if the seller is going to cover the agent's compensation. If you're like, we're already in the middle of a transaction, the seller, whatever the seller's agent or the seller's broker's offering covers this, and I'm also canceling representation, then you would check this box. I wouldn't use this if you're looking to waive the difference in commission from the seller, because again, it cancels the representation, not just that commission obligation. So this is if you really want to do both. Option E is if the buyer owes nothing to the broker. If you're like, just forget it, get me out of here. And then F only applies to an exclusive agreement. And this entitles the agent to compensation on the purchase of any property that falls within that representation period. So any property that they decide to purchase is what they would still be entitled to for that option. And then G, my most dreaded, please don't use this. It's anytime agents get a blank space in a contract, it gives me anxiety because you guys love to pretend to be attorneys. So just leave that part alone. Then the next form is what we were just talking about, the notice of broker involved properties. And again, this is a really straightforward one-page document. It applies to that protection period after the agreement expires or by unilateral cancellation. So you can list the properties or you can check a box to attach a longer list. There's also a reminder to the buyer to provide the notice to any new broker if they're entering into another buyer representation agreement. So the way we talked about the very beginning of the BRBC, this is what they would provide to their new agent. And then a section to verify the date of delivery of when this was provided. Super straightforward. Okay, now going back to the BRBC form, we're only on page 2. This is a 3-page form. All of that was just from page 1. And at the very top of page 2 is section F, which outlines a lesser known element of this agreement. And that is that the broker will disclose to the buyer, either prior to writing an offer or prior to showing a property, if checked, the amount of compensation the broker expects to receive. So again, this is all in transparency's interest, right? So luckily this can be done just by providing a copy of the MLS listing. You can do the CBC form if it's an off-market or a pocket listing, or you can just use this other new car form, the ABCD. Yeah, I can't make this up. The ABCD stands for the Anticipated Broker Compensation Disclosure. And is this an obnoxious form? Yes. Is it still a good habit to get into with your buyers? Also, yes, probably. Remember, we're looking to reframe the conversation around commission. We want to destigmatize it. It's really straightforward. You're providing value. You're providing services. This is the compensation that you receive for it. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody knows you've got to get paid somehow. This is what that form looks like. And so first you have a disclosure to the buyer that the compensation will get paid to the broker, and that the cost of commission, whatever, whether direct or indirect, right, for the seller, has an effect and an impact on the seller's final decision to accept an offer. So that's the whole kind of like disclosure part, right? The buyer can sign there and be done. Now the grid below has an option for initials from the buyer, or you can just provide the MLS printout. So you can give them the MLS printout. It's a good idea. There's, I even think on the buyer printout version, there's a spot for them to initial. But just have them initial the MLS printout, or you can have them initial this form. This is a really easy way to keep track of the properties that you've shown your buyer. Obviously, we're in this market, I'm sure you're seeing a lot more than 6 properties, but you get the idea. This can be also really helpful if you do this maybe each day, each time you go out, maybe you see 6 properties at a time. You can do multiple versions of these forms and keep them in the buyer file. And this can be a really helpful display to some certain buyers, because it demonstrates that fluctuation in commissions offered across similar properties, right? It's like, look, we saw all these properties. This one was, they were offering 1%. This one, they were offering 3%. You know, it can aid. There are certain buyers that, you know, need to see that in writing. And then at the bottom, you could take transparency a whole other step further and fill in the final numbers of commission that you received at closing. And you can be like, okay, these are all the ones we saw. This was the final commission amount based on this sales price and this commission split. Okay, now back into page 2 of that BRBC form, we have section 6, and this outlines what the broker may and will do in accordance with this agreement. So if you're having trouble articulating your value as a buyer's agent, this is a really great section to kind of dive into and elaborate on all the things that you're expected to do. It's a lot more than just opening doors. So you have your standard showing properties, writing offers, negotiating terms, etc., scheduling inspections and attending those inspections, to even providing the buyer a list of vendors to help in their investigation period and work with them on financing requirements with lenders and trying to get them referrals. Being that point of reference and resource for the buyer is part of your agreement in representing them. And so this is a really good spot to kind of, again, articulate some of your value as a buyer's agent. And then that leads us to the next section that talks about what the buyer's responsibilities are under this agreement, right? It's a two-way street. This agreement between two parties. Specifically, getting all necessary personal and financial information over within a certain time frame. The default is 5 calendar days. They need to get all of their stuff over to you and the lender ideally. And if the buyer doesn't qualify, right, if they have outlined in this agreement, these are the properties we want to see, this is the price point, and if they don't qualify for those, the broker now has a right to cancel this agreement, in writing, of course. The buyer is also obligated to notify the broker of any material issues they have going into this process. That's, you know, fairly standard, should be fairly standard practice when working with your buyers, of like, what's a big deal to you, right? If you're like, I don't want properties near power lines, or it's important to me that, you know, there's no septic or a well or whatever. There's a form, of course, buyer material issues. It's a CAR form. They can fill that stuff out. So finally, CAR has some really great resources on this topic. There is a 1-page quick guide you can find at car.org going over, it's called The Misconceptions About Buyer Representation. There's a really awkward video on YouTube. CAR has a YouTube channel. It's dangerous. It actually has some really great insight though from 3 different agents on how they use these forms, the conversations they have in their buyer representation talks with their clients. And then there's even CAR's resource center, which is called Smart Zone. And this has scripts, marketing tools, infographics, even a list of 167 things realtors do for their clients that can, again, help you find and articulate your value to clients when using these forms. So I don't know, let me see if it will let me pop up. Let's see. Can you see this on car.org website?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is that one-page guide, the quick guide. And you can find it when you go to car.org. You go up here to Transaction Center, Risk Management, and then there are all of the legal tools, quick guides. These are all the one-page articles. Oops, I have to sign in. And so you'll see these are all the one-page guides from CAR. They even have a breakdown of this lawsuit that we were talking about as well. But the buyer representation agreement, it's again, one page. Why would you use it? How to kind of pitch it to the client, and so on and so forth. So that is super helpful. Also, again, this YouTube
course creator.
the YouTube video is again, it's really awkward, but it's just a back and forth. You can see here they talk about all these different questions of that they ask of these agents that utilize the buyer broker agreements. So that can be really helpful as well. And then finally, this Smart Zone is through CAR, and this is the 167 things a realtor does, but they also have scripts. They have, these are, I think, Tom Ferry scripts that they have in here, infographics for other topics and things like that, but this is where you can find the 167 things. And again, it just goes down the list of each individual item that you guys do to really help your clients. And yeah, so with that, that's all I've got. Does anybody have any questions?
Ooh, I like that resource. I just pulled that up. I'm gonna put that in the replay when I send it back out to everyone.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. It sounds like I think if we're new to these forums, it sounds like a lot. But I think as you get used to utilizing them and incorporating them into your, your buyer representation, it'll be a lot less overwhelming.
Mhm.
And it's just for your own protections, protection of the brokerage, and protection of your time and the energy that you spend with these clients. We've all been burned, or probably most of us have been burned one time or another. Well, maybe when we were newer agents, or maybe we just got a bad seed that came through our work. But
Yep.
people do weird things, and it's important to protect yourself and protect your time and your energy. And I think learning how to use these forms and these agreements, so it is clear what your role is. It is clear what the buyer expects from you and what you expect from them.
Yeah. And there's a ton of great scripts available online too when talking to your clients about it, where it's like your buyer says, well, the other agents I interviewed, they're not making me sign this. And it's, I know there's a lot of agents out there that like to cut corners, but I really like to make sure that we're as transparent as possible. Things like that, where it's like there's scripts available for how to have these conversations. You guys have value to these buyers. And, in the same way, when you work with an attorney, right, you sign an agreement with an attorney, they're going to represent you. You, may even pay in advance if you need to. But there's also the option that, hey, maybe the other side, if we win this lawsuit, the other side will pay my attorney's fees, right? But you still sign an agreement up front of, okay, I will pay you X amount of dollars at the end of this. And you're working with contracts. You're working with a lot of money. You're working with negotiating on behalf of somebody with another side, another party. So it's a big deal. And it's really in everybody's best interest to get really familiar with these documents and, find a way to work them into your standard operating procedures.
Yeah, that was a good summary. It is a big deal. And when we get so used to just throwing these numbers around and it's a, million two home and blah, blah, blah. But when you really sit down and think about it, you're using your license to do all this heavy contractual work, dealing with loans, lenders, home inspectors, appraisers. It is, a big process.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't look at it and take it for granted as just some menial thing that we just do haphazardly, because your license is your ticket to this industry, and you screw it up, it's not going to be fun.
Yep.
You lose your ticket.
Yep. And I mean, again, if you're working with a buyer that is like, I don't want to sign that. Do you want to be working with that buyer? I mean, especially when the defaults are like, look, this is non-exclusive. This is, this is just putting in writing what I'm agreeing to do for you and what you're agreeing to do for me. And this is how it operates,
Yeah, we're committing to each other, and it's all it's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? So I think it's adopting a good way to explain it, that you're comfortable with and that you do have value, and putting those into words that, like I said, you're comfortable with, that it makes sense. And this shouldn't be hard to get signed. It really shouldn't be.
Yeah. And, again, we don't know how these lawsuits are going to pan out, but from where a lot of them are stemming from, it can all be avoided by just incorporating these forms and these conversations into your regular, appointments and discussions with clients. So, yeah.
Well
Get
said.
into it now before your hand is forced and all of a sudden, you have to be using these. And then you have, resentful buyers or, whatever the case is. So you want to work with people that want to work with you. And yeah, like Bill said, it shouldn't be hard to get these signed.
No, it's very professional to set the expectations on the, at the very beginning. And this is just clearly outlining that. And I think that's just, most people can respect that. And if they can't respect that, then they're not really people that you want to work with. And you're boiling that to a head anyway.
Yep.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. Always a pleasure to have you. And we really do appreciate your insights. Bill, of course, thank you for your insights as well. And agents, thank you very much for coming on our Wednesday webinars. Really appreciate it. So you guys get out there, make it a great week and a productive week. And we will see you guys next week with DJ Bibb. And we'll talk about a lot of, things that he sees top producing agents do. So that's going to be a really, really good one. I'm really excited for it. So see you guys next week, and adios.